Welcome everyone to this session entitled Practice Makes Perfect, How to Avoid Going Down the Traceability Rabbit Hole, with your speaker, Jennifer McCreary, Technical Manager, Training Services, NSF International. Mock recalls are an essential component of a robust food safety plan. In this session, Jennifer will help you reassess your current recall plan and traceability systems to ensure ultimate preparedness in the event of a real recall. A recall is a matter of when, not if, and it can happen to any company anywhere. If you are not prepared, ultimately it can destroy your business. Traceability is a key component to a successful recall. Using mock recall to find holes in your traceability and recall programs will allow you to close the potential gaps and help ensure an effective recall and ultimately maintenance of your company brand. If you have questions for Jennifer, please put them in the comments section and use the question mark icon. And be sure to stick around for post-session chat where you'll be put into small groups so you can meet others and share perspectives on the session. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Suzanne. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think you may be wondering, we've spent the last 2.5 days talking about all of our food safety management systems, our quality management systems. Why are we talking about recalls? Well, part of it is that if we don't have a strong food safety management system or a quality management system, as Suzanne said, it may be a question of when, not necessarily if. So part of it this afternoon is to look at how do we strengthen that traceability program? How do we strengthen that recall program so that when it does happen, we're still protecting our brand? So next slide, please. Okay, I want to start off with just what's the difference? I'm often asked this when I'm working with clients or learners during training programs that we deliver and say, okay, what's the difference? And because often there's a misconception that traceability and recall are the same thing. Recall and withdrawal are the same thing. So just, you can read the definitions there, but I'm just going to kind of give a bit of a short perspective on it. We know that there's been a lot more emphasis on traceability over the last few years. And basically what traceability is can we track the materials, the packaging materials, the food, the incoming ingredients? Can we track where they came from? Do we know who that is? Do we have a unique identifier for it? Do we know the date that it came in? Do we know where it was used throughout our site? And then finally, with traceability is that finished product, where did it end up? How much was it? Who's the customer that it ended up with? How much and where? With recall, the key thing here is kind of almost in that last 2 sentences there. It is that there is a food safety issue or a quality issue, but that the product is not in compliance with legislation within that region. So we saw during the town hall on Tuesday all the different reasons for recalls, primarily the allergens or the presence of pathogens in a product that's there, or regulatory mislabeling issues. And so that's really a recall is that we are not, or our product is not in compliance with the legislation, either in the country of origin or in the country of destination. The final one is withdrawal. And this is also a removal of the product from the market, but there's not a problem from a legislative perspective. What it means is that there may be something that from a kind of a brand protection. And I'll give you an example of one of these is that when I was in the bakery, we had a frozen product that when we launched it, we obviously hadn't done a good job about obtaining packaging material. The packaging material, when it went into the freezer, and this product had a year-long shelf life, after about 2 months, it looked like it had been hanging around for about 5 years. And so it was not really open to consumers wanting to purchase it. So we as a company, if all of the information was there, it was good. It was just that it did not meet our company brand. And so we withdrew that product from the market. So next slide, please. When we think about traceability and recall, there's a number of different requirements we need to make sure that we are uh, adhering to. I'm going to kind of go through and put some highlights about these 4 points, but I'm not going to be going through them in detail. Primarily, we need to know that with all of these, the minimum requirement is one up and one back. I know that you all know that there's been a lot more emphasis in the regulations on traceability over the last few years. We know that that's because of some recalls that went on for just too long, because when the regulatory agency was trying to investigate, they ran into roadblocks. Somebody didn't know where they got it from. It came in from a broker or an agent who'd mixed it together, who hadn't maintained traceability within their own operation. And so the regulations now look and are very specific. We have the FSMA, the proposed rule for food traceability, CFIA, the Safe Foods for Canadians regulations, specifically call out traceability and the need for traceability. So if you are exporting your product, you need to know what are the traceability regulations within the country. As I say, not only where you're making the product, but also the country of destination where you're sending it to, because they may have different requirements in place that's there. So it's making sure that either you or the person who's responsible for maintaining legislation, remember that's one of the key things under SQF, that they are looking at this. If they haven't perhaps looked at some of that legislation in a bit, it may be time to go back and review it and say, okay, are we still meeting everything from a regulatory standpoint? With customers, and kind of customers or your own organization, often will go above and beyond what are the minimum requirements under the legislation. So where it may be that it's a case of being able to identify that, they may give you some specifics around, we want you to be able to identify 100% of that product within a certain time limit that was there. And that's really to protect themselves, protect their brand, your own organization, is really to be able to show and enhance your brand that's there. So looking at this one is to go through and make sure that those are kind of what's in place. And then what I'm speaking about today is really the SQF food safety and quality codes. So we're going to be, since we're all here at the conference, that's going to be my focus. But I think before I move on, I really want to emphasize that the importance of testing, both that traceability and that recall requirement. Sometimes when I'm working with clients or have people in the training programs, this becomes almost a tick the box exercise. It's like they select the easiest product, the one to go through and go, okay, fine, it's done and it's there. But remember, these practices, this traceability and these recall requirements are not only to be able to get that product, that potentially unsafe product off the marketplace, but you want to be able to maintain your company brand. And so if you're able to narrow the scope of that recall or make sure that you are bringing that product back in a timely fashion, that's really going to protect your brand. I'm sure we're all familiar with companies that, there was a recall and then a couple of weeks later, there was another recall and another recall. And that's because as the regulatory agencies went in and looked, is those companies didn't have a good traceability system. And so they were expanding the recalls. So what happens is that sometimes consumers, they'll let us away with that first one. It's kind of an accident that's there. But when they see our name in the news in a negative perspective, time after time, they probably are going to start looking and purchasing from someone else. So have the first poll that's coming up that's here. So if we can go on to the next slide. Going to give you a chance to go up to your poll and answer this one. We'll come back to it in just a minute, give you a chance to think about what your answer is that's in this one. So think about, do we only need to record traceability information for materials that are arriving at our facility, and then where our finished product goes? So do you think that's true? Do you think that's false, or not really sure? So I'm going to come back to that in a bit. We'll give you a chance to answer that and to have that poll. But in the meantime, if we can go on to the next slide, please. Okay, so if you haven't answered, this may be giving you a bit of the answer that's there. So for the purpose of this, I'm not really looking at product information, but going to look at what the requirements are under the code. And as Tammy has said, and we've probably all heard her on a number of times and to go through, is read the code. What does it say? Now, I'm the one who bolded these different spots on the slide, not from SQF itself. So what it is, and this goes back to a bit of the question, the poll that I just had, we have to ensure that our finished product is traceable at least one step forward to the customer. And so if you look at the glossary, the SQF glossary, that's the buyer or the person that has purchased the goods. So that's where it has now left our direct kind of control that's in place. So that's one step forward and then one step back to the manufacturing supplier. And the supplier under the SQF, that's that entity that provides a product or a service to the SQF certified site. Now, going on from there, it's all of the information. So we've got that one step forward, that one step back that's in place, but it's also not only what is the material, where it came from, but we need to be tracking what are the dates that it goes into that's there. And then as it says, that specific requirement around allergens. So looking that if we have that allergen and we're reworking that allergen, that we have maintained that traceability that's there, that's so that we are not putting something that we are not reworking an allergen product into a non-allergen product. And really key is how we are looking at and making sure that that traceability is maintained when we're reworking product. Very often, and this may depend on how your rework system works, is that we collect that product, we set it aside, and then we bring it back and we rework it into a different day. We need to look and make sure that we have identified what that rework was, what that material was, what the codes were with that, and then what product we reworked it into. So one of the things that you may want to think about is I have a few clients that I've worked with that they've actually discontinued their use of rework because of the traceability, the documentation that went into place that's there, that they sent it out as waste. And I think even that was to make sure that that was being tracked. And then ensuring that we have the effectiveness. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more when we get into the recall part of it, but looking at the effectiveness. Are we able to trace? So think about those materials. We've got those raw materials, ingredients, packaging materials, processing aids that we would have. And so are we able to look and know where they came from the information that's there? So I'm just looking, I'm not sure if we have any results from the poll that was in there yet. So if we can, Trulin, if you or Corey, if you can go back to that poll that we just had and see if was in place that was there. That was the one that said we only need to track what comes into us and what leaves our facility. So do we have any results from the poll yet? Okay, this, and you know what, I would have been surprised if it had been anything else but this, because these are your SQF practitioners, your people who are familiar with SQF. But really what it is it's ensuring that people within your organization, it's ensuring people within the going through, so we've got some changes coming in here now. So maybe just how it was interpreted that's there. So what it is with this one, yes, we need to trust the traceability for, oh, nope, that's the second poll that we have. So you're already answering that one. So we'll go back to the first poll. Perfect. Yeah, that one's the one that's false. And that's exactly what I wanted to see from this group. I'm thinking the people that said it was true were maybe misinterpreting and thinking, yes, we do need to understand where it came from and where it goes to. So if we can go back to the presentation, that's great. That's there. So yeah, so when we think about that traceability, I think one of the key things that's here is as somebody said to me, it's like a spider web that happens. So how do we make sure that that spider web is strong? Okay, so this is our product withdrawal and recall. So now, and I want to say that we know that with a product withdrawal and recall, it is possible to do a recall or a withdrawal without having traceability. But what it means is that the scope of your recall is going to be much larger that's in place, because theoretically you're going to be recalling everything that you might have ever made that's in place. I remember once I had a supplier that we're having a bit of a problem with in terms of doing traceability, providing that unique identifier. And I think he thought that he was going to really calm me down by saying, well, you know, if I have to recall, I'm recalling everything. And what it was to me, it was like, you recall everything, I'm recalling everything. And so it's really looking at that traceability is there to help limit the amount of product that we have to truly recall. So with the product withdrawal and recall, we need to identify who it is. So having that team that's in place, we're going to talk about that team a little bit later, kind of the responsibilities that's there. How do we go about handling that recall? Who does what? Being very specific about what the rules and responsibilities are that are in place, looking at who's in place, and then outlining a communication plan. How do we get in touch with people? Remember that there's that requirement that you have to contact both SQFI as well as your certification body. So making sure that they are part of that communication plan. The regulatory authorities are part of that communication plan that's in place. So all of those things that we have to go through. So identifying who it is, identifying what we do, and then communicating it out. And so we'll go to the next slide, please. And so if I know that you were already answering this one previously, and I'm going to just kind of continue on and we'll come back to it, give you a chance to answer this one, is that the poll is saying we need, you know, this is kind of a statement, we need to test the traceability and recall program for every product and material that we use or make. So if you can go on to the next slide for me, please. This is the one that says we have to test that material or that program, testing it and verifying it as effective at least annually. We have to look at the incoming materials and then how they move through our facility and the finished product. And I want to just highlight here is that this is, you know, kind of when we go through and we look at this one is think about the interconnectedness of all of the different SQF programs. So thinking about your purchasing, your supplier approval. What's the information that you require that in place to be able to look at that information, be able to have that information that's supplied to you from the supplier, having that in the purchasing agreement. So this may be about kind of looking at this from a team perspective or a process perspective, is sitting down with your purchasing people, your receivers, the group that looks after your supplier approval. So what's the information that we need to have so that we can have that unique identifier and know what that supply, who that supplier is? Second one, when we look and we're kind of breaking it down, is what are the steps? So thinking about operations, what are the steps? What is the equipment that's kind of common equipment? So maybe we can select one product. Everything is, all the ingredients are common, all of the equipment is common that goes into it. Is that going through is looking at, sorry, I just something just caught my eye, is that equipment. So or we can just do it once and that we can look and say, okay, as long as we know that everything else is common, we've handled it. Or do we have some unique, some specific equipment that's only for a portion of our production? And so we want to test that very specific different equipment as well to make sure that it works. And then finally, with the finished product, is looking at it from, bringing in our team of distribution, dispatch, sales. What is the information that customers are requesting, that are requiring from us? What's the product that we have? What's the amount? How are we tracking that that's there? So thinking of from this product withdrawal and recall is going back to the interconnectedness of the SQF requirements. So from your process flow diagrams, from your supplier approval programs, from your storage and distribution programs, they all fit into this. And as it says, and we'll go back to the poll in just a second, but testing doesn't have to be on every product. But we need to make sure that we are focusing on different shifts, different materials, including bulk materials, a range of products, a range of shifts, and a range of customers that are there. So, Drulin, if you can go back and we'll pull up the poll number 2, the results from poll number 2. So we just kind of answered it there. It's in place. Okay, so we've got about a 50-50 between the true and the false that's there. And I think what it is it may be kind of from an interpretation standpoint. But as you saw, we'll go back to the slides, as you saw that from the code itself is that we need to test it across different products, different shifts, different materials, and a range of customers that's there. It doesn't say that you have to test for every product and every customer that's in place. Okay, so next slide, please. So looking at all those are the requirements. So just looking at this is that from the exercise, a traceability exercise is testing that availability that's there. So as we saw earlier, traceability needs to be reviewed. It's done as a part of the mock recall. So how do we select a product or something that's in there to be able to kind of have a scenario around that? Well, one of the things that I always like to do is to think about from that traceability is that, and traceability almost mock recall, is what was something that perhaps happened to a competitor? That what if? So what if it happened to us? I have one SQF practitioner that I've done a lot of work with. He posts every time there's a recall that's similar to his industry, he will post up where most of the employees are and say, could this happen to us? How could it happen? And how do we prevent it? So that traceability is looking at what has happened to a competitor, or thinking about a situation in-house. So maybe a near miss, something that Joe or Janice caught, and you look and think, you know what if they hadn't caught that? Hadn't brought it forward that there was a food safety issue and we had to go into recall. Do we have the traceability information that's there? great way to be able to support your food safety culture program, to be able to show the importance of that employee stepping forward that's there and why it's necessary to uh, empower those employees. With the mock recall and the simulation here is one of the cautions is that making sure that people don't think that this is a real recall. So I've had companies who will reach out to customers, but the customer didn't realize that it was a mock exercise. And so they started in on their own recall that was there. So as well, think about when you're going through and you're identifying that, is that customer probably not only is handling mock recall inquiries from you, but perhaps a lot of other customers. So reach out to beforehand just to find out if that's something that they would be interested in. And then think about that testing that team, that roles that are and responsibilities of that recall team. Are you able to get in touch with them? Do we have the right contact information for them? It hasn't been for a while now, but I know one company that I did work with, we started to test, reached out to the recall team, and we found that what we had done was that a lot of them, it was a cell phone number. Well, they weren't within cell phone range. And so we had to come up with another way of being able to contact them. Thinking about testing their roles and responsibilities. We often have a backup team. So I always suggest have that backup team run one of your mock recalls and simulations, a total backup team that's there. Great time during a mock exercise to find out if they've got access to all the passcodes, the files, everything that they need. Do they understand their role? There's a big difference between standing behind somebody, watching somebody else do something, thinking, yep, I know how to do that, and actually get in there and realizing how you do it yourself. Next slide, please. So mock traceability here is really looking at, again, that batch code that's in place, tracing, because it's not just tracing the material coming in and the date, but how much that came in. Where's it used in production? How much went into a finished product? We need to be able to reconcile all of that information. One of the things that we have to look at is that sometimes those measurements are different depending on what it is that's coming in and where it's going to. I remember when I worked in the baking industry, our material came in by weight. It was portioned out by volume, and it was then sold on the basis of numbers. If you think of hot dog and hamburger buns, 8s and 12s. So having to reconcile all of that information. So you want to look at that, even prior to your mock traceability exercise, is how do we reconcile all of that information? Remember when I said about with the operations group that's there. If we are relying on equipment, scaling equipment, metering equipment, is it the accuracy? Is it calibrated so that we can depend on that? Next slide, please. So as I say, some things to consider: the amount, the time, bulk quantities. When they're coming in, they're often, if we don't have separate silos or tanks, they're often, kind of dumped on the previous amount that's in there. So it is looking at it and saying, okay, we've got that commingling. What is that commingling? How much is that bulk material? When might we be through it? And I want to just really emphasize here is this is one of the things that when we look at that is that perhaps, especially with bulk equipment, bulk materials, is having a clean point. Having that clean point documented. So looking at it and saying, okay, at this point, we emptied out that tank or we emptied out that silo, we cleaned it and we're starting fresh. Having it documented so that in the event in the future that we have potential recall, we know where it could potentially go back to. As well, thinking about gaps. If you have products, so where's your waste going? How is it measured? One of the problems that I had with one company is, yes, that when the lift truck driver drove into the pallet, it went over into a waste onto a waste pallet. It's who's taking samples. We've got QA samples, we've got selling samples. Is this information tracked by product, that unique identifier? Who took it? Where was it gone to? Really making sure that all of those things are reconciled. Okay, next slide, please. Mock recall, I think very similar, looking at that batch lot codes, who's it's gone to, that's in place, that's there, and then reconcile those quantities. Next slide, please. Some things to consider: contact information. Do we have the right contact information? I had a company that what it was is they felt that they had a great traceability system, but when they went into a recall, what they found out was is that their customer contact information was out of date. So they now had it that their marketing and sales department, it wasn't part of the traceability, wasn't part of recall, it was given to the marketing and sales department to at least once every 6 months to a year reach out. Not only that contact information, but do we have a secondary contact information that's in place, that's there, so that they are able to get in touch? Because as I say, the company that looked at it, their recall, they were able to do traceability within 45 minutes to an hour. It took them over 4 days to contact all of their customers when they were in the real recall. So is it contacting the right people? Do you have a secondary contact? One of the other ones is to look, and I say supplier there, but also thinking of customer. That in this case, within your recall plan, is think of the social media. Are we still relying on the 1-800 numbers on our packaging for consumers to get in touch with us in this digital age? So is somebody in your company monitoring social media? Are they monitoring the contact information on your website? If you're using an outside company to handle your recalls, that not handle your recalls, but handle your customer contact information, have you given them keywords to be able to make sure that they are reaching out to you immediately if one of those triggers is mentioned? So in terms of allergen or illness that's in place. And then looking at it, is that person who's part of that social media to go through, are they part of that recall team? So that they're giving you that information. And then one to kind of think about is one that happened is, what if you only get partial information from your supplier? You get that phone call, they want to go, we just want to give you a heads up that we have a problem. We haven't quite decided whether we're going to go into a recall yet or not. Think about what's the minimum amount of information that you need to be able to go into that recall and to be able to get started. And then back to that supplier approval and contracts, have you made the information and the timelines that they have to give you that information? Is it part of that contract? You really want it to be there so that you have something to go back on if they don't get in touch with you in a timely fashion. Next slide, please. Lots of resources. We've talked about these over the period of time. You've got them there. The guidance document that was just published with edition 9 for product recall and withdrawal. One that you may not be as familiar with, it's in the same resource area on the SQF website, is when the Food Safety Fundamentals program was published under edition 8. There were a number of different tip sheets, and the tip sheet 15 is looking at that product identification, traceability, recall, a lot of great information and suggestion to go through and to have that in place that's there. So 2 really great resources. I think another great resource is to reach out to the community exchange that is in the SQF. There's a lot of the different suppliers of services that will be able to give you information. Reach out to your training centers, reach out to your auditor. Now, your auditor can't consult, but when your auditor is into your facility, ask them what are some of the best practices that they've seen with respect to recalls, mock recalls, traceability that would be in place that's there. So next slide, please. Oh, that's the one, resources. With this one, I'm just going to leave this one here. You probably attended one of these. This was one that FDA looked at. There were 12 different companies. They've given you the link for that. But I went through and looked at some of these. There's some really good suggestions. And this is part of that additional risk, that food traceability list that's in place. So last slide, please. So in summary, just make sure that you've prepared that communication that's there, that you have the customers, you're aware of your most recent contact information, how it flows through your facility that's there, who it's come from, have backup, have that team, make sure that they're aware of it. So in summary is that there's a unique identifier for the product, you know where it came from, who it came from, how much, the date, where it went to, how much, where it went to. Test that effectiveness, really challenge it. Do not be a tick the box exercise. And then take corrective action on any gaps that you saw and verify. When you've put that corrective action in place, verify it. Retest your traceability and recall to make sure that that corrective action was effective. And last slide, please. I thank you very much. I encourage you again to reach out to NSF Community Exchange page, or reach out to us if there's anything that's we can help you out with respect to traceability and recall. There's a number of different companies who are in the community exchange, so reach out to them. You've got a bit more time. We're coming down to the end, but a bit more time to be able to look at that. And finally, I thank you so much and appreciate your time. So Corey, I guess it's over to you for some
Yes, thank you,
questions
Jennifer. That
would
was
be there.
great. So I'll mention a few of the audience comments, and we do have about 9 to 10 minutes for questions. Joe said he likes to see the recall team specific roles and responsibility defined in the withdrawal and recall procedure. So really good point, Joe.
That's a very good point.
Nathan commented that it was a really good point to not test everything but a set of combinations. He really liked that, Jennifer. And Mark said he heard an idea to perform your recall with the second string.
I learned that by accident. And it's one of those things that looking at it and it wasn't the total team wasn't new, but we went into a recall and we found out that, well, actually it was a mock recall. We found out that we didn't have all the passwords that we needed to get into some of the information.
Great. Yeah. And Gary seconded that. He said he liked that idea. He said that his team actually did a recall during the conference this week, and he wasn't there. The backup and primary were not there, and they did a great job.
Again, back to that food safety culture, and recognize that team, that they did a great job. Exactly.
Yeah, and then Jermaine said he sees companies using the substitute. So just a lot of comments about people using not the normal team, but other people trying it out. We do have a question.
Okay.
Commonly asked, how do I decide what materials and products I should choose to conduct my traceability exercise?
Okay. Part of it is that it is don't choose the easiest unless you are just getting started in to test your product so that you get that quick win. But look at it that can we group the products that is there, or look at what would not be typical to go through, because if it's not typical, then it is perhaps something that we're not spending as much time on. We might not trace as much. I'm going to give you an example. Like when I was in the baking industry, we used white flour. I mean, we knew where it came from. We knew where it was going. We knew what was anything that was there. What we would focus our traceability on was perhaps an ingredient that went into a number of products, color that was there, looking at a processing aid. We tend to forget about processing aids because they don't go onto the ingredient list. So look and think of what might be not typical and that you want to be able to show that, if you can do it with that, you can do it with with all of the rest of the products that are there. And don't forget packaging, and don't forget processing aids.
Don't forget packaging. I'm in packaging.
I
So.
was going to say, Corey, I said that for you, but I really
Yeah,
meant it
thank
as
you.
well. People forget about it. They forget about, okay, it's going into something. We need, and that's really looking at that. Can we trace that packaging? Because that was one of the things that we found when we started was we didn't have any way of that unique identifier for packaging. So we worked with some of our packaging suppliers to say, okay, what can we do that's not going to cost us an arm and a leg to put some identification on there that we're then going to be able to trace within our process.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So do I need to use a scenario when I conduct my mock recall?
Not necessarily. Part of it is that, as I say, when I gave kind of two examples of scenarios, is if it's been something that's happened to something else, is that if it happened to someone else, what would happen if it happened to us? Could we be in a similar situation that we wouldn't be able to trace it? Or could it be that we have that information that's there? Or as I say, another scenario is the near miss. I think one of the ones, and probably a number of the folks on the call today, is be very cautious with that scenario of reaching out to your customers. Because there have been, as I say, there's been instances where they've thought that mock recall was an actual recall, or that it's just we were bothering them. So if you're using a scenario that says, we're going to contact, 10 customers, maybe even before doing that, reach out to them and say, are you okay with us doing this? And maybe we can do it a different way. And now we have our sales and marketing group reaching out to them to make sure that they've got the right information.
Mm-hmm. And we do have a question from Nathan. He said, what is the key when you have a lot of ingredients? How can you trace through complex batching processes?
I think the key is your documentation. To go through and to look at that. I know that's always one of the questions that comes up. I think that's probably one of the ones to go through, is that batching, there has to be some commonality in there. Are they going through a common piece of equipment? Are they going through a common scaling that's there, so that we can say, yes, we've got multiple materials, but they're going through something that's in place that we can match that to.
Yeah, thank you. And there is a post-session chat. So if you click on the yellow breakout tab, that will bring you to that. These are randomly assigned, and you can talk to other people in the audience and continue the conversation. And thank you, Jennifer. This was excellent.
Okay, thanks, Corey. Thanks, everybody. And continue the conversation on best practices for traceability and recall, some learnings that you've come up with yourself. So I encourage you to share.